So, carbon markets are one of those topics everyone nods at, even if they don't fully understand it. You hear words like carbon credits, trading emissions, and you think, okay, I should probably understand this, but maybe later. So, today, what we are doing is we are doing that maybe later part. We are trying to break down carbon markets in plain language and hopefully no jargon, no acronyms, and no pretending that we all understood this the first time. I'm Kshitij and I'm joined by Hermia, who is a climate policy professional working on carbon pricing and carbon markets. It's great to have you on the podcast, Hermia.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start at the very beginning. If someone has never heard of carbon markets before, and even if someone has heard it but they still don't have the basics figured out, how would you explain it to them?
I think the very baseline concept for carbon market is that the main idea is to put a price on carbon emission. So we talk about in economics term we have externalities and negative externalities, particularly for greenhouse gas emission. Producers, manufacturers, fossil fuel companies can emit carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere with no cost at all. But at the same time, the negative impact, global warming, actual health impact, sea level rise, etc. All of this has a price behind that. And what carbon market or carbon pricing want to do is to put that price very clearly onto onto carbon emission, putting a price tag there so that with the price incentives, so that companies can make decisions accordingly, knowing there's a real price behind their actions, and they can look into then, oh, should I just emit and pay a certain carbon tax, or should I invest in my manufacturing production line to make it more eco-friendly so that I need to pay less for that price?
Right, so in very simple terms, it's a system that tries to reward emission reductions and make pollution less free, which to be fair, I mean, pollution has been getting away with a lot for a very long time. But moving on to next, a question that people often ask is that why do you need markets at all? So, what's the need of the market in the first place?
So it's also kind of an economic terms, academically speaking. You can use between carbon pricing, there's carbon tax and carbon market. And having carbon tax is the government setting the price limit to determine how much the abatement cost will be. So then company will look at it like, okay, I need to pay $10 for the emission, or I put $10 into my own devices, my own manufacturing line to make it more eco-friendly. Whereas for the market part, a carbon market or a cap and trade system, they put the quantity in control, and then the market will decide how much does that actually cost. That puts that has a little bit more political feasibility and better acceptance between companies, because if a company is very eco-friendly, they can then sell the extra permits to the other companies, and then it turns into an opportunity where they can actually make some money out of it, instead of a tax that is everybody needs to pay a certain price. There's no chance to actually earn money from it. Whereas for the voluntary carbon market, that is more right now, in my very own opinion, is more like a compensation measures. I think having the market helps to not. There's no one in a global voluntary carbon market situation. There's no one authority there to set the price, but the market would decide on the price. So on the voluntary aspect, in my opinion, is more like the lack of authority being there to like, hey, this is the price. So alternatively, we let the market to decide what is the emission price will be.
Okay, I think you explained that very comprehensively, but just to break things down, we'll speak about voluntary and compliance later because that's another complication that people don't understand. But coming down to basics as to how companies make money and what do they actually trade and what does that trade actually entail?
Yep. Sorry for jumping into that before. Maybe we should start by explaining the compliance and voluntary differences. Within the compliance system, there are also different designs now because different countries want to fit it into their national contacts. But talking about the most classic cap and trade mechanism, so the cap is when a country set a maximum amount of emission allowed of the covered sectors. Usually it will be energy industry. Occasionally you have waste, transportation as well. And then that cap will reduce annually, or over a period of time, that cap will slowly reduce so that it can be matching with the decarbonization pathway that countries have set up for themselves. And under that, let's say the cap is 100 tons of carbon dioxide emission, then that 100 tons per ton, it will then transform into a permit to emit, basically. And usually it's called an allowance. So that allowance can be freely allocated to companies. It can also be auctioned out to companies or installations. And from there, then they have the allowance and they need to surrender the amount of allowance corresponding to their annual emission. And so they will have then need to think about, should I spend more money to buy more allowance, or should I reduce my emission so that I have extra allowance? And if another company has more emission and they need to buy more allowance, then I can sell it to another company. And then in a way that could be, in terms of a long-term investment decision, if I decarbonize now, in 5 years I can be selling these allowances to other companies and make my investment even more reasonable. You can justify it better with a board, for example.
So one is voluntary, one is compliance based, but both have a similar objective, which is to infuse or drive more climate action. And I think these are very broad in themselves. One is national setting, one is at a corporate setting, and can be at an international setting as well, which is something that I don't want the viewers to get confused with. But talking from a very geopolitical way of it, that the price of reducing carbon emissions is different for different geographies. It can be expensive for one and might be cheaper for the other. So how do you bring that picture into the whole concept of carbon markets?
That is a really good question. I think on a national compliance discussion, you can see it on the EU perspective, perhaps. This is a controversial perspective. They now have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which reflect that the EU has a much higher carbon price than the rest of the world. It's about 70 to 80 euro at some point per tons, whereas I remember in China it would be like about 8 euro or $8 per ton. And that obviously reflect like the different costs of abatement, the different decarbonization progress that countries are at right now. But then in industries in EU, we're like, hey, we're paying a lot higher carbon price than other countries, and it makes us internationally, in terms of competitiveness, it really hurt our competitiveness. People think our products are so expensive, and this is one of the reason, the drive behind the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Of course, people have very different views on that, but from the EU, working in the EU, that is the perspective that I see from my work. Whereas on a global level, we talk about the carbon, the Paris Agreement, the Article 6, the global carbon market. One of the incentive is like, if I need to spend, let's say, $1 million for decarbonization, I might be able to achieve a lot more in developing countries, because the labor cost is cheaper, the land cost is cheaper. There is more opportunity to develop new technologies, etc. And because it's always the last couple tons of carbon that is the most expensive to abate. So if I can spend that money in the developing countries, perhaps that will make a greater impact than what I would spend it in developed countries. But at the same time, there's also the concern where a lot of environmental group is like, hey, this is just outsourcing your pollution to other countries. You're not doing decarbonization locally. It is a huge concern, obviously, but at the same time, it does come from a price concern, a financial concern, that with the same amount of money, where can I make the most impact out of it? How to mitigate the concern of delaying actions, that's a whole different podcast topic.
Definitely. And the entities that are involved in this, be it a country or an organization or anyone, but ideally, does this also mean that finance that is generated out of these transactions between two entities, does it flow to the regions that need it the most, often developing countries? In theory, carbon markets can support climate action while also supporting development priorities. But in theory, being the key phrase here, I mean, climate policy has taught us to be very careful with that. So, does that really happen?
I think a lot of countries have very different opinions on it, and whether it's a national projects, for example, between Switzerland and Thailand to corporate to corporate decision making. Right now, this is also one of the reasons why carbon market has such a bad reputation. That a lot of the projects are on forestry and preserving forests, keeping them standing. It might not be the biggest national development priorities, but it is a voluntary organic process between corporates, and this is land-based carbon credits is kind of one of the easiest the methodologies are there, everything are there. It's easy to set up, it's easy to sell, and it's also relatively cheaper. In theory, it should direct more money into per national priorities, as you said, but then right now, this is my opinion. The Paris Agreement crediting mechanism had just been finalized last year in Baku. A lot of things are still being set up, and we really need developing countries to have a clear set of projects. Like, here are our national development priorities, and here is where we need finance to flow to. With that clearance, with that transparency, then companies or governments can act accordingly to, like, hey, okay, this is where the money needs to go to, and this is how we're going to support them. And it can be like a bilateral agreement between governments. It could be corporate-led initiatives, but we first need to have that transparency, and of course, financial support, capacity building for developing countries to identify where they need support the most is also very important and relevant in that discussion.
So I think transparency and capacity building is what I am looking at as keywords in this conversation. But again, breaking it down very simply, if you can just explain what a national carbon trading might look like, what a corporate level carbon trading might look like, who are the actors involved?
So it kind of maybe I should first clarify the terminologies. When we talk about a compliance carbon market, and the word suggests it is a government-led initiative, covered entity. Usually, it's based on how much emission they're having or how much fossil fuel they're consuming. That set up the threshold. That is mandated by the government. There's no way that you can just opt out unless you reduce your emissions so significantly or you reduce your productions. So it's mandated by the government, and usually the unit that is transferred is called an allowance. So it allowed you to emit. Whereas in a in a national context, the government purpose of this is to mandate carbon dioxide reduction. And for a voluntary carbon market, usually the terminology we use is carbon credits. And what is being traded there is not really the permit or the allowance to emit. Instead, it is trading a credit generated from carbon dioxide removal or reduction activities. So I plant a tree here, it absorbs so much carbon, and that we sell it as a carbon credit where companies can offset their emissions. Hey, I reduce 1 ton of emission here to offset my tons of emission from my manufacturing line. So the idea there is not to mandate reduction. The idea there is more to offset my emission so that the net emission will be zero in that case. The gross, so the gross emission minus the gross removal, then it will be the net zero, ideally.
I think coming again, I'm again poking you towards the basics of it. But if, in your opinion, if a country who has not explored the carbon market space, which is the type of market that they should ideally go for? Is it voluntary, or should it be starting with a compliance market? Any case studies that you've come across, or in your personal opinion, what should be the best way forward?
I think they serve very different purpose. Let's put it that way. The first, usually, from my experience, like from my work experience, the first step is usually proper MRV in the country. So like monitoring, reporting, verification process, so that you know where are the main emission sources from your country, and then you can then based on that to see whether they have enough technology abatement options that is available, so that you can't just charge a sector with carbon price without knowing whether there's abatement options that is available for them. Otherwise, just a tax. Like, there's no way out for them. There's no way to transition into a more eco-friendly production process. But then among countries, let's go back to like perhaps the compliance part first. between compliance, carbon pricing, there's always the tax versus the emission trading system. And one of the key consideration is how big your market is. I remember hearing Singapore, for example, they have a very small market. They do not have a lot of industrial process. So for them, a carbon tax makes more sense because for such a small market, the liquidity is high, the price volatility is going to be very high, and it doesn't make a lot of sense for their companies. So the market size is also a big determining factor of like how what kind of policy instrument you should choose. Another one is the emission trading system in theory works. In some way works better because you let the market to determine the price and you always have the quantity in control, whereas for the tax you do not really control how much quantity, you just determine how much the price will be. So in terms of controlling emission, the ETS will be a little bit better in that sense, but it's also a lot harder to set up. You need a lot of registry, you need a lot of mechanism that allows exchange to allow that to be transactional. So there's also the administrative and setup costs around that. Whereas the voluntary carbon market, it helps move direct corporates, for example, to direct climate finance into certain area that perhaps nationally or from a government public sector perspective is a little bit hard to provide in that sense or provide in scale. So in my opinion, the voluntary carbon market does more of redirecting financial flow, whereas the compliance market does more of the mandating emission reduction. So I think
Understanding the sources of emissions differing in differing geographies is something that countries should decide that with, and I think the viewers will understand the nuances involved in different type of markets. Now coming to the critical part, carbon markets, although they sound promising, but what can go wrong if they're not well regulated per se?
a lot of things can go wrong. I think the two main area we kind of called it in the carbon market terms, environmental integrity and social integrity. Environmental integrity is where we need to ensure additionality. So additionality means that if this intervention doesn't exist, this emission reduction or emission removal would not have happened. So I remember reading an article about I think it was clean development mechanism and how it supported wind farms building in India, and they were comparing. They're finding similar wind farms of like similar locations, similar amount of wind floating, and seeing how profitable different wind farms are, and find out whether if this wind farm would have take place without without the clean development mechanism money supporting. And I think half of it could have happened regardless whether the CDM money was there or not. So that ensuring additionality in that case, especially with investment related additionality, is quite hard to quantify, or you can only kind of look into the additionality after it has been set up. So verifying it and showing that has been challenging. Permanence is another issue that has been challenging. So planting trees is great. It's a nature-based solution. It also have other co-benefit around it. But then trees are also prone to wildfire. You can always accidentally burn down some trees, and then the emission that should have kept underground will then be released again because the tree has burned down. So the permanence, how permanent is that removal or reduction? That is also a big concern within the carbon credits or carbon market decision making. And on the social integrity, I think that's the even more prominent and concerning part. A lot of land-based carbon credit projects, planting trees or preserving forests. There's also a lot of land rights issues and land right violations that comes along with it. And I remember Carbon Briefs has this article looking into from 2018 and 2023. About 70% of carbon credit projects has concern with like land rights or human right violations. That has also causes a lot of backlashes to carbon market in general, which I think is very justifiable and is very important for. I think government regulation then play a huge role in this to make sure that land rights are well respected. Government is not being part of the persecutor, but an active protector of their own people. I'll stop here, but I think we can dive deeper into this topic.
I'm glad that you highlighted the socio-economic part of it, especially the socio part of it, and how governance can impact the socio-economic realities of that geography. So, although this was not on my to-do topics for today, but because you mentioned it, how can governance in one country affect socio-economic realities of other countries? And I'm hinting towards CBAM here. There was this whole debate at COP30 as well, which we had a brief conversation about, that tools like CBAM affect socioeconomic realities of other countries, and especially developing and underdeveloped countries. What would you say on that? And you can have a non-political, neutral answer, just to give some light towards how these tools impact different countries.
I think from my perspective, the reasoning behind CBAM is justifiable. That the EU does have a much higher carbon price. But how can that be reflected in other countries? The problem, I think, a lot of us, well, not within the youth activists, and we try to have this conversation as well. I think one of the key elements that we want to talk about is CBAM revenue. Like, okay, you have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and you're protecting your own industry, and you're trying through that mechanism, it actually encourage or force a lot of other countries to look into carbon pricing instruments now, and as establish things so that they can minimize the impact from the CBAM. It is very important to also talk about the revenue use, because then the money is now they collected from EU importers of these goods. Right now, 75% of the CBAM revenue will be going into the EU budget. That has been set, I think, back in 2021. And I think just a few days ago, they're talking about the remaining 25% for 2 years, 2028 to 2029, will then be set up a temporary fund for their own industry within EU, for a temporary decarbonization fund. So no money that from this policy that could be impacting a lot of developing countries will then go back into developing countries, helping them with decarbonization efforts, which is not the most fair. I mean, it's not fair. Let's put it that way. It's not a fair measure, in my opinion. Developing countries has a higher emission intensity of a lot of these goods, which is very true. But without kind of the broader discussion, without a good NCQG, the new quantifiable, collective quantifiable goal on climate finance, without essential technologies transfer, without capacity building support, how are you expecting them to decarbonize? And now one of the financial sources that could have gone into perhaps loss and damage fund or a global decarbonization support fund is now going into EU industries. But at the same time, living in the EU, I also see how much lobbying effort the industry could have. And there's also a lot of concerns with like job loss and the industry dying, the economic slowdown and everything. So from a political sustainability perspective, I'm not sure is debated.
Fair enough. And with the number of conversations that I've had about CBAM with people, I think this was the most balanced answer, which can give a perspective to people without them forming an opinion. So governments play a central role, is what we have discussed, in setting rules, overseeing markets, and making sure that the carbon trading aligns with national climate goals. So the risk isn't just environmental, it's both economic and strategic. And like you said, they need to support long-term transition, short-term gains. But to wrap this up, carbon markets are not a solution on their own. Carbon markets is just a tool. Like any tool, they depend on how they're designed, governed, and different potentials for different entities involved. Thank you for listening to Climate Policy 101. And if this conversation helped make carbon markets a little clearer, that was the goal. If not, if it raised more questions, that's probably even better. But thank you, Hermia, for joining this conversation. And I feel that the concepts have come out in a non-opinionated way, which can help people form some perspective about the topic in general and also the geopolitics that surround it. And definitely we can list down, I think, at least 10 subtopics that can come out of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can have a 201 next year on this.
Definitely.